Thank you for joining us for a look at the last day of Julius Caesar. Before we begin, please consider subscribing to our channel. Now lie back and join us on this journey through Caesar's final day, the night before the Ides of March hung heavy over Rome. The streets were quiet, yet the city did not rest. Shadows moved between pillars and alleys, whispers travelled faster than the wind. Men who had once been allies of Caesar now prepared to raise their hands against him. Each heart beat louder as the hour drew near. But in the house of Caesar there was another kind of silence. It was the silence of unease. The day had ended with Caesar tired yet restless. He had presided over business, spoken to friends, given orders to messengers. He was still at the centre of power, still the master of Rome. Yet power has weight, and Caesar carried it upon his shoulders. His body was not as strong as it once had been. He was 66 years old. His head often ached. His limbs betrayed him with sudden weakness. He would rise in the morning with fire, but by evening he needed rest. He walked through his home with the ease of a man who knew no rival. His steps were steady, his voice calm. To servants he spoke with command, but also with the faint warmth of habit. To those closest to him he gave words that revealed little. For Caesar was a man who lived within walls of discipline. Yet even a man who had crossed rivers of blood could not control the strange air of that night. Calpurnia, his wife, was troubled. She had seen visions in her sleep. She had woken with cries that broke the stillness of their chambers. She clutched at him, begged him to listen. She told him she had seen his body bleeding in her dreams. She told him she had seen the walls of their home dripping with blood. She had seen doors open and armed men rushing inside. Her voice shook as she begged him not to go to the Senate in the morning. Caesar listened as a husband, not only as a ruler. He held her hand, tried to calm her, tried to dismiss the dread as shadows of the mind. But though his words carried reason, his heart was not entirely free. He had lived his life aware of omens. He had crossed battlefields with priests beside him, studied the flight of birds before great wars. He was not a man to laugh at signs from the gods. Yet he was also Caesar, the man who had risen above all others, who had dared to take power none had dared to claim. He lay down beside her, but sleep did not come. His thoughts moved to the Senate. He knew there were men who hated him. He knew that even those who smiled in his presence carried knives within their hearts. But Caesar had never let fear dictate his actions. He believed in destiny. He believed in the greatness of his name. He told himself that no Roman could raise his hand against him without bringing ruin upon himself. He told himself that his life was too vital to Rome for any to risk destroying it. Yet as the night deepened, the house itself seemed uneasy. Servants moved with caution. Guards at the gate whispered. The torchlight flickered with strange patterns. Even the dogs in the courtyard stirred and growled. Rome itself felt alive with tension, as though the city were waiting for something to happen. Beyond the walls, the conspirators plotted. They met in quiet corners, in houses away from prying eyes, in the gardens of noble men who hid their intent behind smiles. Brutus, Cassius, Casca, Trebonius, and others shared oaths. They sharpened their daggers. They spoke of liberty, of the Republic, of saving Rome from tyranny. But beneath the talk of virtue there lay envy, ambition, fear. They did not all share the same reason. Yet they were bound together by the decision that Caesar must fall. Caesar, in his chamber, turned again and again. Calpurnia urged him to stay at home the next day. She begged with tears. He told her he would consider it. For a moment he thought of yielding to her fears. Perhaps he would not go to the Senate. Perhaps he would send word that he was unwell. But the thought soon turned bitter in his mind. To stay away would look like weakness. To bend to a dream would be to confess fear, and Caesar had built his life upon strength. Still, the night carried omens beyond her dream. A storm passed across the sky, lightning cutting through clouds, thunder shaking the earth. People in the streets cried out that the gods were angry. Strange sights were reported. Men walking aflame yet not burning, beasts wandering through the forum, voices in the air that had no body. Priests sacrificed animals and found their livers torn and diseased. These were not small signs, these were warnings. Even so, Caesar told himself that he was greater than fear. He had marched into Gaul with no army but his own. He had crossed the Rubicon, though the Senate forbade it. He had seized power by daring what no other dared. How could he now tremble at shadows in the night? Yet his heart was not stone. As Calpurnia wept, he kissed her hand and said he would listen. She pressed him again, and in that moment he agreed. He said that he would stay at home the next day. Her relief was deep, yet fragile. She knew his pride, she knew the weight of duty. In the stillness before dawn, Caesar rose. He wrapped himself in his cloak, moved to the atrium. He breathed the air of his house and thought of the day ahead. He was tired of civil war, tired of endless plots. He wanted to bring peace to Rome, to shape it into the empire he dreamed. But peace had enemies. His vision of Rome required power, and power creates resentment. He knew that too well. Messengers came early, bringing word of business in the Senate. Among them was Decimus Brutus, a man Caesar trusted, though Decimus was part of the plot. He told Caesar the Senate waited for him, that the people expected him, that his absence would look like scorn. Caesar hesitated. Calpurnia's words still rang in his ears, but Decimus spoke with skill, urging him to rise above superstition, to show strength. Caesar listened, and his mind shifted. The sun began to climb. The streets awoke with sound. Rome was alive again, though beneath its life there was a current of fear. Few knew what was about to unfold, yet many felt the weight of destiny in the air. Caesar prepared himself to leave his home. He had decided to go to the Senate. The night had ended. The last night of Caesar's life. The dawn broke over Rome with a soft glow, but the air was heavy. The light spread across rooftops and temples, and the city stirred with the rhythm of daily life. Merchants opened their stalls, soldiers changed their watch, children chased each other in the narrow streets. Yet beneath the sound of waking Rome, there was a sense that this was not a day like others. It was the Ides of March, and though most felt it was only another date, a few carried fear in their hearts. In Caesar's home the servants moved with quiet haste. They brought water, laid out clothes, tended to lamps that had burned through the night. The smell of bread drifted from the kitchens, yet their faces betrayed worry. They had seen the unrest of their mistress, the dreams that had shaken her sleep. They whispered among themselves, glancing at Caesar as he rose from his chamber. Caesar was wary but steady. His frame was wrapped in a white toga edged with purple, a mark of power. His shoulders carried the air of command, though age and illness showed in his features. He walked with the slow authority of a man who had been obeyed for decades. His eyes held a faraway look, as if the weight of unseen thoughts pressed upon him. Calpurnia followed him, her steps soft, her face pale from worry. She begged him once more to stay at home. She reminded him of the storm, of the omens of her dreams. She told him the gods had spoken, that he must listen. She clung to his arm and would not release him. Her voice was not that of a senator or a general, but of a wife who feared for her husband's life. For a moment he wavered. He thought of the words he had given her in the night. He thought of the promise to remain safe in his house. He thought of how easy it would be to say he was unwell, to send word that he would not come. The Senate would meet without him. Business would wait. Yet his pride stirred against the thought. To stay behind would be seen as weakness. To obey a dream would be mocked as foolish. He had built a life on defiance of fear. Could he now bow to shadows? As he stood in thought, a messenger arrived. It was Decimus Brutus, his ally, his trusted friend. He came with words that carried weight. He told Caesar that the Senate waited for him, that matters of state demanded his presence, that his absence would bring shame. He said the senators might think he mocked them if he stayed at home. He spoke with calm, with reason, with loyalty in his voice. Caesar trusted Decimus and listened. Slowly the decision shifted. He told Calpurnia that he would go. Her face fell with despair. She begged once more, but Caesar had made his choice. He called for attendants to prepare his litter. He told them he would go to the theatre of Pompey, where the Senate now gathered. He moved with calm authority, but his wife wept in silence. As preparations were made, another man arrived at the house. It was the soothsayer who had once warned him. The man's eyes were deep, his words cautious. He reminded Caesar to beware the Ides of March. Caesar smiled with faint mockery. He said the Ides had come. The soothsayer replied they had come, but not yet gone. The words hung heavy, but Caesar brushed them aside. He would not bow to prophecy. He would not yield to fear. The streets outside were alive with movement. Crowds pushed past, carts rattled, sellers called out their wares. Yet when Caesar appeared, there was a hush. People parted as his bearers lifted the litter. Some bowed, some whispered, some watched with cold eyes. Caesar was both loved and feared, honored and resented. He had given Rome greatness, but he had also taken power for himself. Not all hearts were loyal. As he was carried through the streets, he spoke little. His mind was restless, his thoughts shifting from doubt to pride. He thought of the power he held, of the honors given to him, of the crown some had offered though he had turned it aside. He thought of the enemies he had defeated, the wars he had won. He told himself he was untouchable. Yet deep inside, something stirred, a faint unease, a shadow that would not leave. Around him the city swelled with noise. Priests moved to temples, senators walked in groups, soldiers patrolled the roads. The forum was crowded with traders and citizens. Some called out to Caesar as he passed, praising him, asking favors, seeking his gaze. Others stood silent, their eyes narrow with distrust. Caesar had lived long enough to know the look of envy and hate. Yet he had also lived long enough to ignore it. As he drew closer to the theater of Pompey, he saw familiar faces. Friends, allies, men of the Senate. They greeted him with words of honor, with gestures of respect. But among them were also those who carried daggers hidden beneath their togas. They smiled, they bowed, but their hands were cold with intent. Caesar, lifted high in his litter, did not see what lay behind their eyes. He thought instead of Rome itself. The city was the heart of the world, the prize he had claimed, the empire he had shaped. He thought of what he wished to build, of the legacy he would leave. He believed he had more years, more victories, more power to wield. He did not think this was his last morning. The sun climbed higher and warmed the stones of the city. The crowd grew denser, the noise louder. Caesar's bearers moved with slow strength, guiding him toward the Senate. The theater of Pompey stood waiting, grand and solemn. It was a place of politics and power. Yet its stones carried the shadow of Caesar's rival, the man he had once fought and defeated. The irony was there, but Caesar did not dwell on it. He was focused on duty, on presence, on the image of strength. Calpurnia remained behind, her heart heavy. She feared she would never see him return. She prayed to the gods, begged for mercy, hoped against the signs that weighed upon her. But her prayers were faint against the tide of fate. As Caesar's litter moved through the final stretch of streets, one more figure pressed forward. It was Artemidorus, a teacher, a man loyal to Caesar. He carried a scroll, a warning. Inside it was the list of names of those who planned to strike. He tried to reach Caesar, tried to hand him the scroll, begged him to read it. But the crowd was thick, the bearers pressed on, and Caesar passed him by. The warning remained unread. The morning of Rome moved on as though nothing were strange. Children laughed, merchants shouted, soldiers stood in watch. Yet all of Rome was walking toward the edge of change. The fate of Caesar was sealed in silence. He sat in his litter, proud and calm, moving step by step toward the place where friends and enemies waited together. The morning had begun with dreams and dread. It now moved toward action and blood. Caesar's choice had been made. The Ides of March were not yet gone. The litter moved through the streets with slow rhythm, each step of the bearers measured against the flow of the crowd. The people of Rome watched as Caesar passed. Some lowered their heads in respect, others called out in praise, and a few muttered words that could not be heard above the noise of the city. The sun had risen higher now, casting a pale light across the marble walls, the tiled roofs, the statues that lined the forum. Everywhere there was movement. Soldiers changed their posts, slaves carried baskets of grain, sellers held out fruit and bread. Beggars reached with open hands. Life went on as it always did, yet beneath it all was the weight of destiny. Caesar sat high above in his litter, calm yet thoughtful, watching the city that had been both his prize and his burden. His eyes moved over faces, buildings, temples, but his mind was far from settled. He thought of the warnings he had dismissed. He thought of Calpurnia's tears, of a dream that had shaken her to the core. He thought of the storm that had filled the night with fear. He thought of the soothsayer who had told him to beware this very day. These thoughts came and went like shadows, and still he brushed them aside. He told himself that greatness did not bend before signs. He told himself that Caesar was stronger than fate. The bearers turned a corner and the litter rocked gently. The streets grew tighter as they neared the theatre of Pompey. Here the noise of the crowd thickened. More senators gathered on the way. More citizens pressed in close. Some reached out to touch the edge of the litter, as if the touch of Caesar's robe might bring them fortune. Others spat when they thought no one saw. The city loved him, but it also feared him. Rome had always feared kings, and though Caesar had refused the crown, many whispered that he would not refuse it forever. As the procession moved, a familiar voice rose above the noise. It was the soothsayer once more, pressing close enough to be heard. He spoke with urgency. He said that the Ides of March had not yet passed. Caesar, proud and unshaken, leaned from his litter and told him that the Ides had come. The soothsayer's reply was sharp, that they had come but not gone. The words hung in the air like a warning carved into stone. Caesar leaned back and smiled faintly. He did not show fear, though something within him shifted. The streets narrowed again. The people made way, stepping back against the walls as the litter advanced. The bearers kept steady, their faces stern, their eyes fixed ahead. Behind them trailed a small guard, not the full force of soldiers that might have been expected. Caesar had not filled the streets with men in armor. He had chosen to show trust in his people, to show that he ruled with confidence, not fear. That choice would soon weigh heavy. Along the way men approached with petitions. They knelt and stretched out scrolls, begging for Caesar to hear them. Some begged for mercy, others for favor. Caesar took none, though he glanced at them with the air of a man who might later give answer. Among these men was Artemidorus again, clutching his scroll with desperate hands. He forced his way to the front and tried once more to give his warning. He begged Caesar to read it at once, to look upon the names written there. But the bearers pressed forward and Caesar brushed him aside, saying he would read it later. The scroll was lost in the movement of the crowd, the chance to know the truth slipping away. The streets opened into wider ground and the theatre of Pompey came into view. Its stone walls rose with weight and pride, its steps filled with senators and attendants. This was where the Senate gathered now, not in the Forum, for the old building was under repair. The irony of the place was sharp, for the theatre had been built by Pompey, once Caesar's greatest rival, a man he had defeated in civil war. To enter here was to step into the shadow of his fallen enemy. As he neared the steps, more senators approached. They greeted him with warmth, with bows and smiles, though many carried blades hidden beneath their robes. They walked close to his litter, speaking words of respect, their voices smooth though their hearts were dark with intent. Caesar listened with faint nods, not seeing what lay beneath their show of loyalty. His thoughts turned instead to what awaited him inside. He thought of debates, of laws, of the power that rested upon his words. He thought of the empire he was shaping, of the glory Rome might yet hold. He thought of peace, of order, of the strength of his name. He did not think of daggers. He did not think of betrayal. The bearers slowed as they reached the steps. Caesar stepped down from the litter, his feet touching the stone with calm authority. He stood tall in his toga, his hand raised in brief greeting to those gathered. His face was composed, his stride steady, though within him there remained that faint whisper of doubt, that memory of warnings. Yet he walked forward without pause. The people behind him shouted praise. Some cried his name, others cheered for Rome. The air was thick with noise, but among it was silence too. Those who would strike him down said nothing. Their eyes followed him, their hands touched the hidden hilts of their blades. They waited for the moment when the theatre doors would close and their plan would be set. Caesar climbed the steps with calm strength. His robe caught the light of the sun, the purple edge bright against the white cloth. His hair was touched with grey, his face marked with the years of war and rule, but his presence was unbroken. He was still Caesar, the man who had crossed the Rubicon, the man who had defeated armies, the man who had made himself master of Rome. The theatre of Pompey loomed above, its shadows deep against the brightness of the day. To step inside was to step into history, into fate. Caesar moved forward, his bearers behind him, his guards at a distance. The crowd watched in awe, in fear, in silence. The procession had ended. The moment of destiny was near. The theatre of Pompey stood like a giant of stone, its steps broad, its columns tall, its shadow stretching across the square. It was more than a theatre, for within its walls were gardens, chambers, and halls for the Senate. Built by Pompey at the height of his power, it had been a gift to Rome and a mark of his pride. Now it served Caesar, the man who had broken Pompey's legions and taken his place as master of Rome. To enter here was to walk into the ghost of an enemy, and though Caesar had triumphed over him, the irony of the place could not be denied. The air outside was alive with sound, yet within the great portico it grew still. Senators gathered, their togas flowing as they moved in clusters, their voices low, their eyes darting towards Caesar as he stepped through the arch. They bowed, they smiled, they called his name with reverence, yet their hearts beat with hidden fear and darker resolve. Behind their masks of loyalty lay the sharpened edge of betrayal. Caesar advanced with calm steps. His hand brushed against the folds of his toga, his gaze steady upon the hall ahead. He had stood in countless chambers, faced countless men, spoken words that had moved armies and shaped nations. This was no different, also he told himself. He was here to rule, to guide, to command. The Senate waited for him, and he would not fail them. The hall of meeting lay beyond the gardens. Statues lined the path, faces of gods and heroes carved in stone, their silent eyes watching the living pass. Among them stood the statue of Pompey himself, cold and eternal, his face stern, his hand raised in a gesture of command. It was here that fate had chosen to stage its cruel play, for the rival who had once opposed Caesar would now watch him fall at his feet. The senators walked beside him, their words smooth, their voices eager. They spoke of petitions, of favours, of laws that required his assent. They pressed close, yet not too close, each one waiting for the moment to strike. Cassius glanced toward Brutus, Brutus glanced toward Casca, each one reading the fear in the other, each one holding back the tide of dread with the thought of liberty and honour. They told themselves this was for Rome, yet their hearts beat fast, their throats dry with the weight of what was to come. Caesar moved with dignity. His steps echoed against the stone, his toga trailing softly behind. He carried himself as one who had no fear, though shadows pressed around him. He had dismissed omens, dismissed dreams, dismissed the warnings of friends and strangers. He told himself the gods favoured him, that destiny would not abandon him now. Yet in the silence of the hall, even he must have felt the weight of unseen eyes. The chamber of the Senate opened before him, wide and solemn. Benches lined the sides, seats for the men of Rome to gather, to speak, to vote, to shape the fate of the Republic. Light poured through the high windows, casting long beams upon the floor. Dust rose with each step, hanging in the sun like threads of gold. The air was thick, heavy, as though the stones themselves held their breath. One by one the senators entered with him, their voices hushed, their faces calm. They took their places, though some remained close, too close, their hands hidden in the folds of their robes. Others lingered at the edge, eyes flicking toward the doors, their bodies tense as if ready to flee. It was a gathering of men who claimed to serve Rome, yet half of them had sharpened daggers waiting in silence. Caesar stepped to the front, his seat prepared, his authority unquestioned. He lowered himself with slow grace, his back straight, his gaze steady. He was ready to hear them, ready to judge, ready to command. For a moment the chamber was quiet. The murmurs faded, the shuffling ceased, and all eyes rested upon him. Outside, the city moved as always. Children laughed in the streets, sellers cried out their wares, soldiers clashed their shields as they drilled. The world beyond the theatre knew nothing of what was about to unfold within. The fate of Rome balanced upon a breath, yet the people carried on, unaware that empire was about to be born from blood. Inside, the conspirators gathered their courage. Cassius whispered to Brutus. Brutus nodded with faint resolve. Casca touched the hilt of his hidden blade. They had spoken of liberty, they had sworn oaths, they had promised to save Rome from kingship. Yet now, with Caesar before them in the flesh, their resolve trembled. He was no shadow, no idea. He was Caesar, and his presence was greater than words. To raise a hand against him seemed like raising a hand against the gods. Yet they knew it must be done. Caesar looked upon them with calm eyes. He spoke with the tone of command, asking of petitions, hearing their voices, giving answers with the weight of authority. His words carried power, but also wariness. He had ruled long, he had fought long, and though his spirit was strong, his body showed the years. Still, his voice filled the chamber, and none could doubt who ruled Rome. The statue of Pompey loomed in the chamber, tall and cold. It stood as if watching, as if waiting, its stone gaze fixed upon the man who had once been its rival. Beneath its shadow, the conspirators closed in. The theatre was filled with silence that trembled beneath calm words. The senators shifted in their seats, the guards remained at a distance, the conspirators waited for the signal. The morning that had begun with omens and warnings now drew near its breaking point. Caesar, unaware, continued with his work. He believed himself safe among men who called themselves his allies. He believed himself untouchable, the master of fate. He believed the gods walked with him, yet the gods were silent and the daggers were near. The theatre of Pompey, built by one rival, would now serve as the stage for his fall. The stone walls, the marble floor, the statue of his enemy, all would bear witness. The hall that had seen debates and laws would now see murder. The place chosen by chance or fate had become the perfect stage for the most famous act in Roman history. Caesar sat in calm authority, unaware that each passing moment drew him closer to the end. The senators moved like actors in a play, their faces set, their lines rehearsed, their daggers hidden but ready. Rome itself seemed to wait in silence, the weight of centuries pressing down upon the chamber. The theatre of Pompey stood tall, timeless, unmoved by the hearts of men. Yet within its walls, history bent. The chamber was filled with quiet tension. The benches of the Senate were lined with men who shifted in their seats, their eyes upon Caesar, their hands folded in their robes. Some were calm, some restless, some pale with fear. They had come to decide the fate of Rome, yet the choice had already been made. The daggers were hidden, the plan was set, the moment only waited for its hour. Cassius sat near the center, his face calm but his thoughts storming. He had long feared Caesar's rise, long hated the sight of power gathered in one man's hands. He told himself this was not envy but duty. He told himself Rome must be free, that no man should be king. Yet in his heart there was envy too. He had once been great, once been honored, yet now all honor went to Caesar. He told himself liberty was his cause, yet his cause was tangled with pride. Beside him was Brutus, calm in face yet torn in soul. He was known for his honor, his love of the Republic, his noble name. Caesar had trusted him, loved him almost as a son. Yet here he sat with dagger hidden, ready to strike. Brutus had told himself it was for Rome, that Caesar must fall or the Republic would die. Yet his heart was heavy, for he knew this was also betrayal of a friend. His mind was caught between duty and love, and both tore at him with equal force. Casca was there too, restless, sharp-eyed, his hand already upon his blade. He had little patience for delay. He wanted the deed done, wanted the moment to arrive, wanted to feel the steel in his hand and the blood on his arm. He had no love for speeches, no taste for long debate. He would be the one to strike first, and in his mind he had already struck 100 times. The others sat close, their faces masks, their bodies tense. Decimus Brutus, who had guided Caesar here, now waited with false calm, his voice ready to flatter even as his hand prepared to kill. Trebonius lingered near the edge, tasked with keeping Antony at bay, his heart beating fast with the thought of what was to come. Cinna, Ligarius, and others sat in silence, each man alone with his fear, each man telling himself he was part of something greater. They had spoken many times before this day. They had gathered in houses by night, sworn oaths in secret, sharpened blades in silence. They had spoken of liberty, of Rome, of the fear of kings. They had told themselves they acted as Brutus had long ago, when his ancestors struck down the last king. They told themselves they were saviors, not murderers. Yet here in the chamber the truth was harder. Here Caesar sat alive, powerful, majestic, his presence a storm against their resolve. To strike him was no longer words, no longer theory. To strike him was to bring blood into the chamber, and to risk their own lives upon the floor. Cassius leaned toward Brutus. His words were low, a whisper carried like smoke. He asked if he was ready, if he was firm. Brutus nodded, his face pale yet set. Cassius drew breath and steadied his hand. Casca glanced from one to the other, his grip tight upon the hilt hidden in his toga. The air between them was thick, heavy, alive with fear. They watched Caesar as he spoke. His voice was calm, commanding, filled with the weight of authority. He answered petitions, gave orders, settled disputes. His words carried strength, yet also ease, the ease of a man who believed he had nothing to fear. He did not see the daggers in their eyes. He did not see the tremor in their hands. He believed himself safe among men he had raised, among allies who owed him everything. The plan was clear. One would approach with a petition. Caesar would refuse. The others would press close, each with words, each with pleas. The circle would tighten. Casca would strike first, then the others would follow. The blades would rise and fall until Caesar was no more. The hall would be filled with blood, but they would call it freedom. They would stand as liberators, not as murderers. They told themselves this even as their hearts beat with dread. Some prayed in silence, asking the gods to give them strength. Some sweated beneath their robes, their palms wet against the hilts of their daggers. Some thought of the glory that would follow, the statues, the praise, the honor of saving Rome. Some thought only of survival, that if they did not strike, Caesar would destroy them all. Each man had his reason, yet together they shared one fate. The statue of Pompey stood in silence, its stone face watching. To the conspirators it seemed a sign, a witness to their act, as if Pompey himself would nod in approval. To others it seemed a curse, a reminder that even great men fall. The weight of the stone figure pressed upon them, as if the past itself had come to judge the present. The air in the chamber grew heavy, the silence deep. The conspirators looked to one another, eyes flicking from face to face. They waited for the signal, the moment when one would rise and the others would follow. No man wanted to move first, yet all knew it must be done. Their plan had been woven tight, yet even now threads of doubt pulled at it. But doubt could not last. The hour was near, the act must be done. Caesar's voice carried across the hall once more. He dismissed the petition, waved his hand with calm finality. His face was composed, his body at ease. He leaned back slightly, as though the matters of Rome were well in hand. At that moment the conspirators knew the time had come. Cassius shifted in his seat. Brutus tightened his jaw. Casca touched the hilt with resolve. The others followed suit, each man preparing to rise, each man setting his heart against fear. They told themselves again that this was for Rome, that their names would be remembered with honor, that the Republic would breathe free once more. They told themselves this, though in truth their hands shook. They leaned forward. The circle would close. The steel would rise. The blood would flow. Rome would change forever. The chamber was still. The light through the high windows fell across the floor in long beams. Dust hung in the air like threads of gold. The statue of Pompey stood tall and silent, its stone face hard and cold. At its base sat Caesar, calm in his seat, his toga drawn close, his gaze steady on the men before him. He had dismissed a petition, waved away a request, spoken with the air of one who believed himself unshaken. Around him, the senators shifted, their eyes restless, their hands hidden in their robes. The moment was here. Metellus Cimber was the first to rise. His face was smooth with false humility, his steps slow, his voice soft. He held a petition in his hands. He came before Caesar and knelt, asking that his brother be recalled from exile. His words were filled with pleading, his body bowed in show of respect. Caesar looked upon him with calm disdain. He shook his head, his voice sharp. The law had spoken, the exile must remain. Metellus pressed closer, begging, his hands stretched out. Caesar's voice grew firmer. He told him to rise, to stop wasting breath, to respect the authority of Rome. His face was stern, his tone unbending. Metellus lowered his eyes but did not step back. Then another came forward. It was Brutus, his robe falling in heavy folds, his face pale but composed. He too pleaded for the exile to be lifted. Caesar looked at him with the gaze of a father upon a son. He spoke with calm but firm denial. He would not change his mind. Cassius stepped forward then, his voice joining theirs, his tone low yet urgent. He spoke of mercy, of justice, of the need to show favor. Caesar's eyes grew dark. He raised his hand to silence them. His words rang with authority. He told them that his mind was fixed, that he stood as constant as the northern star. He said their pleas were useless, that he would not bend. The circle grew tighter. Senators pressed in close, their robes brushing against one another, their hands hidden still but ready. Caesar sat tall, his voice carrying strength, but his space shrank with each step they took. The air was thick with tension, the silence heavy beneath their words. At last Casca moved. His eyes were sharp, his hands steady. He stood behind Caesar, his dagger drawn in silence from beneath his robe. For a moment he hesitated. The weight of the act pressed upon him, the thought of striking the ruler of Rome froze him. Yet then he forced his hand forward. With sudden force he stabbed downward, the steel cutting into flesh. Caesar turned, his voice sharp with shock, a cry of pain bursting from him. He reached for Casca's arm, his strength still fierce, his eyes blazing. He cried out in words that rang across the chamber, asking Casca what he thought he was doing. Casca shouted for help in Greek, his voice breaking the silence, calling his allies to join him. The others surged forward. Cassius drew his dagger, Brutus reached for his blade. The circle closed tight. Steel flashed in the light. Robes flew back, hands gripped hilts with desperate force. Caesar struggled to rise, his body strong though wounded, his hands reaching to push them back. His voice was loud, his anger clear, his power still alive. Another blade struck, and then another. The daggers cut into his side, his chest, his arms. He fought them with his hands, pushing, striking, grasping at their robes. Blood spread across the white of his toga, dark stains that grew with each blow. The chamber filled with noise, cries of rage, shouts of fear, the clash of sandals against stone. The conspirators struck again and again. Each man who had sworn the oath now raised his hand. Each dagger rose and fell, each wound opened flesh and spilled blood. Caesar staggered beneath the blows, his strength vast yet breaking. His eyes turned from face to face, seeing not strangers, but men he had trusted, men he had honored, men he had raised to power. Casca struck again, Cassius struck, Cinna struck, Decimus struck. The blades tore through cloth and skin, the air heavy with the sound of steel meeting flesh. Caesar gasped, groaned, cried out, his breath breaking with pain. Yet he still fought, still tried to stand, still tried to resist. At last his eyes fell upon Brutus. Brutus, his friend, his ally, the man he had loved like a son. Brutus raised his dagger with trembling hand, his face pale with dread yet hard with resolve. For a moment Caesar faltered, his strength drained not by steel but by betrayal. The wound was deeper than the blade, for it came from one he had trusted most. He spoke then, words that history would echo. Whether he said them in Latin or Greek, whether the words were what legend made of them, none could deny their weight. He looked upon Brutus and his voice broke with sorrow. He asked if it was truly him, if even Brutus had turned against him. His heart gave way in that moment, and though his body still bled, his spirit fell. The blades kept striking. 20-30 times they cut, each man eager to claim his share of the deed, each man driven by fear that if he did not strike he would be seen as weak. Caesar's body gave way at last. His blood stained the floor, his robe torn and soaked, his limbs failing him. He stumbled toward the base of Pompey's statue, his hands reaching for balance. There, beneath the stone face of his rival, he fell. His body slumped against the marble, his blood pooling at its feet. The conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome, the man who had crossed the Rubicon and broken the Republic, now lay still. His eyes closed, his breath ceased, his heart beat no more. The silence that followed was deep, broken only by the sound of his blood dripping upon the stone. The conspirators stood above him, their daggers stained, their robes torn, their chests heaving with breath. They looked upon what they had done, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They had killed Caesar, yet the weight of it pressed upon them heavier than they had thought. They had told themselves it was for liberty, for Rome, for honor. Yet in that moment it felt only like murder. The chamber was filled with the stench of blood. The statue of Pompey stood unmoved, cold and eternal, as if mocking the man who had fallen at its feet. The light through the windows fell across Caesar's still body, his toga soaked in red, his face calm now in death. The Senate Hall, once a place of words, had become a place of silence and ruin. The assassination had begun, and Caesar was no more. The chamber was filled with echoes of violence. The cries had faded, the clash of sandals against stone was gone, yet the silence that followed was heavier than any noise. Caesar lay at the base of the statue, his body folded against the marble, his toga soaked in deep red. Around him stood the men who had sworn the deed, their hands still trembling from the force of the blows, their daggers dripping with blood that would never wash clean. The air was heavy with the stench of iron and sweat. Dust drifted in the beams of sunlight, falling upon the scene as if the gods themselves looked down in judgment. The moment that defined it all was not the strike of Casca, nor the steel of Cassius, nor the thrusts of Cinna or Decimus. It was the sight of Brutus stepping forward, his blade raised with pale hand, his face strained between love and resolve. The others had struck as conspirators, as rivals, as men of envy or fear. But Brutus was different. Brutus was the one Caesar had trusted above all. To Caesar, Brutus was not merely a senator or ally, but a man he loved like family. Their bond had been strong, their trust deep. Caesar had given him honor, had shielded him from suspicion, had believed his loyalty beyond doubt. When Brutus moved closer, the chamber seemed to hold its breath. Caesar's eyes, clouded with pain yet sharp with fury, searched the faces of those who surrounded him. He had seen treachery in the strikes of others, but now he searched for hope in the face of Brutus. He looked for mercy, for loyalty, for the hand of a friend who might stop the storm. Yet he saw the dagger raised. He saw the choice had been made. The blow had not yet fallen, but the betrayal was already done. Legends tell us he spoke words that would echo through the ages. Eat too, brute. Some say he said it in Latin, others claim it was in Greek, perhaps softer, more intimate, like a whisper of heartbreak. Some believe he said nothing at all, that the words were later shaped by poets to give voice to his silence. Yet whether spoken aloud or written upon the air of history, the meaning was the same. It was not the cry of a ruler struck down by rebels. It was the cry of a man wounded by the hand of one he loved. Those 3 words carried the weight of sorrow greater than any blade. In them was disbelief, grief, and resignation. Caesar had fought armies and crushed rivals. He had marched through Gaul and across the Rubicon. He had faced storms and plots. But here, in this hall, beneath this statue, he faced betrayal from the one he thought closest. The wound of Brutus cut deeper than steel. It pierced his soul. Brutus's face was pale, his hand shaking as the dagger came down. He struck not with passion but with duty as he understood it, with a resolve shaped by the belief that he was saving Rome. Yet the strike was slow, heavy, lacking the fury of Casca or the eagerness of Cassius. It was the strike of a man torn, who gave the wound not for hatred but for what he thought was necessity. Caesar's eyes met his in that instant. The bond was broken. Caesar's strength gave way. He no longer fought. He no longer raised his arms to block the blades. His body sagged, his was slipping, as though Brutus's strike had stolen the last of his spirit. He pulled his toga about him, drawing its folds over his body, covering his legs, arranging himself as if in dignity. Some said he did this so he might fall with grace, not exposed like a common man. Even in death he sought to be Caesar, to remain noble, to control the manner of his fall. He sank against the base of Pompey's statue, the marble cold against his body, his blood spilling across its feet. The irony was sharp, for Pompey had once been his ally, and later his rival. Now Caesar lay dead beneath his image, as if the gods had staged the scene with cruel design. The conqueror of Pompey's armies now lay defeated at Pompey's shadow. The statue loomed above him, silent and eternal, while Caesar's body grew still. The conspirators stepped back, their daggers raised no more, their arms heavy, their robes stained with crimson. Their breaths came hard, their faces pale. They looked upon Caesar's body with eyes that held no triumph, only shock. They had done what they had sworn to do. They had struck down the man who threatened to be king. They had killed Caesar, yet in that moment it felt less like victory and more like loss. The chamber itself seemed to recoil. The light through the windows fell across the floor where his blood spread in dark pools. The smell of iron filled the air, sharp and bitter. The silence was broken only by the sound of their ragged breaths, the faint drip of blood from their blades. The Senate Hall, once a place of words, was now a place of murder. Brutus stood above Caesar, his hands still trembling, his eyes locked upon the fallen man. He told himself it was for Rome, that he had done what was right, that he had followed the path of his ancestor who had struck down kings. Yet within him was sorrow deeper than words. He had killed not only a ruler but a friend, a man who had loved him, who had trusted him. The wound he had given was not only upon Caesar's body but upon his own soul. The others looked to Brutus for strength. Cassius tried to steady his breath, to remind himself of the cause, to call this liberty. Casca wiped his blade, his face hard but his eyes restless. Decimus Brutus looked down in silence, his mind heavy with the role he had played in guiding Caesar here. Each man stood alone with his thoughts, yet bound together by blood. They had shared the act, and now they shared the weight. Caesar's body lay still. His toga was torn and stained, yet he had arranged it with care, so that even in death he looked like a leader, a man of dignity, a figure of Rome. His face was calm now, his eyes closed, as if he had found peace in surrender. The lines of anger and pain were gone. Only stillness remained. Outside the hall, the people of Rome still moved in their daily life, unaware of what had been done. The cries of sellers, the laughter of children, the chants of priests rose in the air. The city lived, yet within the chamber its master lay dead. Soon the news would spill into the streets, soon the world would change. But for now, silence held the hall. The conspirators gathered their courage. They raised their daggers high, still wet with blood, and called out that Rome was free. Their voices rang in the chamber, forced and hollow. They told themselves they had struck for liberty, that they had restored the Republic, that they had saved the city from tyranny. Yet the echoes of their cries did not hide the truth. They had killed Caesar, but in doing so they had unleashed forces they could not control. The words, "It too, brute," lingered, whether spoken aloud or imagined in memory. They lingered because they carried more weight than any speech, more power than any blow. They spoke of betrayal deeper than politics, of love broken, of trust shattered. They were the last words of a man who had shaped the world, spoken not to an enemy, but to a friend, and in them lay the sorrow of all Rome. The chamber was still once more. The statue of Pompey looked down, unmoved. The blood spread across the floor, dark against the marble. Caesar lay beneath it, noble in death, betrayed in life. The men who stood above him were shaken, their daggers lowered, their voices fading. They had killed a man, but they had also killed more than that. They had killed the Republic they claimed to save, though they did not yet see it. The silence was deep, and within it the ghost of Caesar seemed to linger. His power was gone, yet his shadow stretched longer than ever. The Ides of March had claimed him. Yet through his fall Rome would rise again in a new form. His death was not an end, but a beginning, though none in the chamber yet knew. For now, there was only stillness, the sound of breath, the sight of blood, and the weight of 3 words that would never be forgotten. The hall was thick with silence. The air stank of iron, sweat, and fear. Caesar lay still at the base of Pompey's statue, his toga soaked with dark blood, his limbs folded in stillness, his face calm now in death. Around him stood the men who had struck him down. Their daggers hung loose in their hands, their robes torn and stained, their eyes wide and restless. They had killed him. Yet none of them seemed to know what to do next. The weight of their deed pressed down upon them like a mountain. For a moment they looked at one another, their breaths harsh, their bodies shaking. They had sworn this was for liberty, that they had saved Rome, that the Republic was restored. Yet in the quiet of the chamber their shouts rang hollow. They stood not as heroes, but as men stained with murder. Their eyes avoided Caesar's body, for though they had slain him, his presence still filled the hall. Even in death he seemed greater than all of them combined. Then Cassius raised his arm. His voice, sharp and trembling, broke the silence. He cried out that Caesar was gone, that Rome was free, that the Republic was safe. He called upon the gods to witness that they had struck for liberty, not for hate. His words rang in the chamber, yet they felt weak, as though even he did not believe them fully. His face was pale, his hands shook, and the blood upon his blade dripped in heavy drops upon the floor. Brutus stepped forward. His face was calm but heavy, his voice steady though filled with sorrow. He told the others to stand firm, to remember their cause, to remember that this was not murder but sacrifice. He said Caesar was ambitious, that Caesar would have made himself king, that Rome must never be ruled by one man. His words carried weight, for Brutus was known for honor. The others clung to his voice, for it gave them a cloak of reason in the face of their deed. The senators who were not part of the plot had already fled. When the first blades flashed, they had rushed for the doors, their sandals slapping against the stone, their voices raised in panic. Some had tripped, some had cried out, some had shouted prayers to the gods. Now the chamber was nearly empty, save for the conspirators and the dead. The benches stood abandoned, scrolls and tablets scattered, as if the hall itself recoiled from what had been done. The conspirators gathered in a circle, their robes heavy with blood, their faces drawn with strain. They spoke in low voices, urging one another to stand tall, to claim the deed as noble. Cassius called for courage. Casca muttered of liberty. Cinna urged haste to leave the hall and speak to the people. Brutus alone stood calm, his eyes upon the body of Caesar, his thoughts torn between grief and duty. They feared the guards might come, feared the crowd might rush upon them, feared that Antony, Caesar's ally, might raise men against them. They spoke of how to leave the chamber, of what words to use, of how to frame the act before the people. They agreed they must go into the forum, must show themselves unafraid, must tell Rome that Caesar's death was the birth of freedom. But the hall did not echo with freedom. It echoed with silence, with the sound of blood dripping upon marble, with the whispers of fear in each man's heart. The statue of Pompey looked down, its stone eyes fixed upon Caesar's fallen body, as though mocking the men who called themselves liberators. At last they moved. They bent down and touched their hands to Caesar's blood. One by one they smeared it upon their daggers, upon their robes, upon their skin. They told themselves it was a sign of honor, that they had nothing to hide, that they had struck openly for Rome. Yet the sight was grim. Their white togas, once pure, now dark with stains, made them look less like heroes and more like butchers. Their blades dripped, their hands were red, their faces streaked with sweat and blood. Brutus spoke again, telling them to follow him into the forum, to show the people they feared nothing, to declare that Rome was free. His words gave them strength, though it was a fragile strength held together by need. They gathered themselves, they lifted their heads. They prepared to leave the hall. The doors were thrown open. Light from the square flooded into the chamber, harsh and bright. The conspirators stepped out, their robes soaked, their blades held high. They shouted to the people that Caesar was dead, that Rome was free, that tyranny had been struck down. Their voices rose in unison, though behind the sound was strain, the strain of men trying to believe their own words. The people who stood near the theatre froze in shock. Some cried out, some turned and ran, some stared in silence. The sight of Caesar's killers, their bodies marked with blood, their faces fierce with forced courage, was too much to bear. The crowd scattered, the square filled with cries and fear. None rushed to praise them, none shouted joy. Rome did not welcome the death of Caesar. Rome trembled. Back in the chamber, Caesar's body remained alone. The silence returned, heavy and deep. His blood pooled upon the marble, seeping into cracks, staining the floor of the hall where laws had once been spoken. His toga, drawn over his limbs, gave him dignity even in death. His face was calm, as though he had accepted the end. Yet his presence lingered, heavy upon the air, greater in death than in life. The conspirators' cries faded into the distance as they moved toward the forum. The chamber was left in shadow, filled with the ghost of what had been done. The statue of Pompey loomed above, silent witness to the fall of his rival. The hall of the Senate was no longer a place of law, but a place of blood. The aftermath had begun. The Republic was claimed, yet chaos stirred. The conspirators had struck. Yet the world beyond the theatre did not yet belong to them. Rome had lost its master, but in losing him it had lost its balance. The air was filled with fear, and the future with storm. In the chamber the silence remained, deep and endless, broken only by the drip of blood upon stone. Caesar lay still, yet in that stillness his shadow grew. The men who had slain him walked away with daggers high, but it was not their names that would endure, it was his. The news did not move slowly. It ran like fire through dry fields. From the steps of the theatre to the streets of the forum, from the markets to the temples, from one whisper to 10, from 10 to 100, the word spread. Caesar was dead. Caesar had been struck down in the Senate by men who called themselves friends. He had fallen not in battle but in the heart of Rome. At first the people did not believe it. They thought it a rumor, a trick, a lie born of envy. Caesar had seemed untouchable, a man greater than kings, a man whom the gods themselves had favored. How could such a man lie dead beneath the statue of Pompey? Yet as more voices cried the same words, as eyes that had seen the blood swore the truth, the crowd began to tremble. Panic came fast. Some rushed home, their sandals slapping against stone, their voices crying out to family. Some fled the city gates, fearing war, fearing slaughter, fearing that Caesar's armies would sweep in to avenge him. Some dropped to their knees in prayer, begging the gods to save Rome from ruin. The streets filled with cries, with dust, with the sound of chaos. Merchants abandoned their stalls. Soldiers left their posts. Priests looked to the sky as though answers would fall from the clouds. Mothers clutched their children, dragging them into doorways. Old men shook their heads and muttered of curses. The air of the city, once filled with the rhythm of trade and talk, now pulsed with dread. The conspirators marched through the forum with blades held high. Their togas were stained with blood, their faces fierce with forced pride. They cried out that Caesar was dead, that Rome was free, that tyranny was ended. They told the people to rejoice, to see them not as killers but as saviors. They shouted that the Republic lived again, yet the people did not rejoice. They looked upon the bloodied robes, the crimson blades, the pale faces, and they saw not saviors but murderers. They heard not freedom in their cries but fear. They backed away, their eyes wide, their voices low. Some spat curses, some wept, some fled. The words of liberty rang hollow against the grief that already grew in their hearts. For Caesar had been more than a man to them. He had been their champion, the one who had given them grain, the one who had brought them wealth from Gaul, the one who had led them to glory. He had been their protector, their father, their symbol. They loved him not for power alone, but for what he had given to Rome. His fall felt not like freedom, but like loss. Among the crowd walked Antony. He had not been in the chamber when the blades fell, for Trebonius had held him aside, had spoken words to keep him from Caesar's side. Yet Antony heard the cries, saw the blood upon the conspirators' robes, felt the weight of the truth. His face was still, his eyes sharp. He knew the danger, knew he must not act rashly. He bowed his head as the killers passed, showing no threat, hiding his fury. He walked in silence, watching, waiting. The city swirled with fear. Some whispered that Caesar's legions would march at once, that war would break out, that Rome would drown in fire. Others whispered that the gods would strike, that lightning and plague would fall upon the killers. Others whispered that Rome was cursed, that no peace would ever come again. The conspirators made their way to the capital, the high ground of Rome, where they could hold themselves safe. They carried their blades still red, their robes still soaked, their voices still crying liberty. They thought the people would join them, would gather in praise, would hail them as heroes. Yet the people stayed back, their faces dark, their hearts broken. The killers stood alone, their cause hollow, their freedom empty. Meanwhile the body of Caesar was left in the Senate hall. Servants crept in, trembling, their eyes wide with fear. They lifted him with care, wrapped him in cloth, bore him out through the streets. When the people saw the body, covered but stained, the grief deepened. They followed in silence, some weeping openly, some striking their breasts, some crying out to the heavens. The sight of Caesar, once so strong, now still, tore at their souls. Word reached every quarter. In the Subra the poor wailed. In the villas, the wealthy whispered in fear. In the camps outside the city, the soldiers muttered of vengeance. Across Rome, there was no joy, only dread. The killers had thought to free the Republic, but the Republic was not what the people loved. They loved Caesar. They loved the man who had given them bread and triumph, who had stood above all, who had promised them greatness. Antony moved with caution. He did not flee, nor did he strike. He went to his home, gathered allies, spoke with quiet words. He knew the city would rise in grief, that the killers would soon be hated. He knew that Caesar's death was not the end but the start. He waited, watched, planned. His time would come. Night fell upon a city restless. Torches burned in the streets, voices cried in the dark, rumors spread like smoke. Some said the killers would be hunted down by dawn. Some said Caesar had risen as a spirit to haunt them. Some said armies marched already from the north. No one slept in peace. The city groaned like a wounded beast. The killers sat upon the Capitol, their voices raised in argument. Some feared the people, some feared the soldiers, some feared one another. Cassius urged strength, Brutus urged calm, Casca urged escape. Their unity frayed even as their blood dried. They told themselves Rome was free, yet they knew freedom was slipping away. The next morning the people gathered in the forum. They looked not to the killers but to the body of Caesar, laid out for them to see. His wounds were counted, his robe torn, his blood plain. The sight struck their hearts. They wept, they cursed, they raised their fists. Rome did not see freedom. Rome saw murder. Rome saw betrayal. The killers had thought the people would cheer. Instead, the people grieved. Their grief turned to anger, and their anger waited for a voice to guide it. Antony saw this. He waited, silent and patient. Soon he would speak, and when he spoke, the city would rise. The death of Caesar had shaken Rome, but the reaction of the people made clear what the killers had not seen. Caesar had been more than a man. He had been the hope of the people. And hope, once killed, does not vanish. It becomes fire. The body of Caesar was carried through the streets with slow steps. Wrapped in cloth yet stained with blood, it was laid upon a bier for all of Rome to see. The people followed in silence, their faces heavy with grief, their voices low with mourning. The man they had called father, champion, and master was gone. His limbs, once strong with command, now lay still. His eyes, once sharp with fire, were closed forever. Yet in death he drew the people to him more than ever he had in life. The forum was filled with the weight of his absence. Torches burned though the sun was high. Crowds pressed together, shoulder against shoulder, waiting, whispering, trembling with sorrow and anger. Senators stood in silence, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with fear. They had not joined the killers upon the Capitol. They stood apart, unsure where the tide would turn, unsure what Rome itself would demand. Antony stepped forward. His face was stern, his eyes deep, his robe plain yet marked with the shadow of grief. He had waited since the hour of death, saying little, biding his time. Now the moment was his. He stood beside the bier, beside the body of the man he had served, the man who had raised him, the man he now mourned. The crowd hushed as he lifted his hand. He spoke with voice calm yet heavy. He told them he did not come to praise Caesar, nor to curse the men who had struck him down. He told them he came to speak truth. His words were plain, yet each one cut deeper than steel. He reminded them of who Caesar had been. He told them of the triumphs he had won, the riches he had brought, the lands he had claimed for Rome. He told them of the grain he had given, the gifts he had left, the love he had shown for the people. He told them Caesar had wept for the poor, that Caesar had refused the crown though it was pressed upon him. The people listened, their eyes upon him, their hearts stirred. Some wept, some clenched their fists, some whispered prayers. Antony's words moved like fire through dry wood. He spoke of Caesar's love for Rome, of Caesar's mercy, of Caesar's greatness. And then he spoke of Caesar's wounds. He turned to the bier. He drew back the cloth. The body lay revealed, the robe torn, the wounds plain. He lifted the fabric with care, showing the holes, the stains, the marks of each blade. He told the people where Casca had struck, where Cassius had cut, where Cinna had thrust. He told them of Decimus, of Trebonius, of Ligarius, and then he told them of Brutus. His voice softened, heavy with sorrow, as he showed where Brutus's hand had given the wound. The crowd gasped, their grief turning to rage. Antony spoke again, asking if this was honor, if this was liberty, if this was justice. He asked if Caesar deserved to fall beneath the blades of those he had trusted. He asked if Rome should call them heroes or traitors. His words stirred the people like a storm. Their cries rose, their anger broke free, their grief turned into fire. Antony did not stop. He spoke of Caesar's will. He held the scroll in his hand, though at first he said he would not read it, for it would move them too much. The people cried out, begged him to read. At last he opened it, his voice steady, his words clear. He told them that Caesar had left his wealth to the people of Rome. He told them that Caesar had given his gardens for their use, his treasure for their good. He told them that even in death Caesar had given more than he had taken. The crowd broke then. Their grief became fury, their sorrow became rage. They shouted curses upon the killers. They called for vengeance. They raised their fists to the sky. Antony stepped back, his task done. He had not told them to rise. He had only shown them the truth. The people themselves demanded fire. They rushed to the bier. They lifted the body of Caesar and bore it through the forum. They tore benches, stalls, and doors from their frames. They piled wood high. They laid Caesar upon it, his toga still stained, his face calm in death. Torches were thrown, flames rose. The fire caught fast, the smoke rose high. The body of Caesar burned before the eyes of Rome. The people wept and wailed as the flames consumed him. They cried his name, they shouted his honors, they called upon the gods to take him among them. Mothers tore their hair, soldiers beat their shields, children clung to their fathers. The fire roared, the smoke curled into the sky, the ashes of Caesar lifted on the wind. Grief turned to fury. The people rushed with burning brands to the houses of the killers. They sought to drag them out, to tear them limb from limb. They smashed doors, they shouted curses, they filled the streets with fire and blood. The killers fled, hiding, trembling, their cries of liberty lost in the roar of vengeance. The forum itself became a sea of flames and cries. Caesar's pyre burned until the night, its glow lighting the city, its smoke black against the stars. The people gathered around it, their faces lit red, their voices lifted in grief. They swore they would never forgive, never forget, never rest until Caesar was avenged. Antony stood apart, his eyes fixed upon the fire. He had waited, he had spoken, he had moved the people without force, without command. He had shown them Caesar's wounds, Caesar's gifts, Caesar's love. And the people had risen of their own will. He knew then that the killers had lost, that their cause was dead, that Rome belonged once more to Caesar even in death. The ashes of the pyre were gathered with care. Some took them to keep as relics. Some scattered them with tears upon the soil. Some swore oaths upon them, vowing to avenge him. The memory of Caesar did not fade with the smoke. It burned hotter, brighter, stronger than before. The night was filled with flames. The streets echoed with grief and rage. Rome itself seemed to tremble, as though the stones of its walls had felt the wound. The killers had thought to save the Republic, yet they had only lit the fire that would end it. For from the ashes of Caesar's pyre would rise empire, and his name would never die. The Ides of March had taken him, but the people of Rome had made him eternal.